Florida admits defeat. They are moving on from the Kiffin sweepstakes. We've got everything you need to know. Locked on LSU. Here we go.
You are Locked On LSU, your daily podcast on the LSU Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Okay, let's get it. It is Locked On LSU, your team every day. I'm your host, Matt Moscona. Thanks so much for making us your first listen. We're free, available wherever you get podcasts, of course, on YouTube as well. So please subscribe. And as always, one of the fastest ways to help us grow is by leaving your comments below. So thank you sincerely for that. And thank you for helping make the Locked On Podcast Network the #1 sports podcast network in the world. We're glad to be here. So it is Black Friday. As we're recording this, the Egg Bowl is taking place. Currently, this very moment, Ole Miss is leading Mississippi State 14-7. But just as the game was kicking off, a report came from Zach Abelverde, who covers the Florida Gators, that Florida was moving on from its pursuit of Lane Kiffin. The exact tweet, citing sources, Florida does not expect to land Ole Miss coach Lane Kiffin and is closing in on other targets. In recent days, sources said Kiffin's erratic communication and behavior has led UF to think he may be more interested in his other options. No kidding. Chris Lowe later confirmed that report, and basically all the particulars in college football who cover the sport at a national level have reported the exact same thing. But if you listen to the Locked On LSU podcast and you're an everydayer, shout out, you already knew this to be the case. I have said pretty consistently here, and I'm not here to take a victory lap, but what I'll do is explain to you in a little more detail the Kiffin Florida situation, where it stands presently and where everyone is going to pivot to now, because clearly I've been right. And the unfortunate thing for a lot of the people who cover Florida, they just did a very poor job. There's no other way to say this. They did a poor job covering this story. What I think I'm at liberty to say at this point, and you've heard me say that I think the Florida beat was about a week to 10 days behind the news cycle. And a lot of people have heard me say that and say, what does that mean? Well, I do believe, I'm going to say this again, I do believe early in this process that Lane Kiffin to Florida was very real, that was a likelihood, high probability that he was going to end up at Florida. And what you've heard me say consistently is two things happened. Number one, LSU fired Brian Kelly and then got in earnest interested in Lane Kiffin, made him their top target. And Ole Miss kept winning, which has complicated this whole thing in the timeline of how this all would transpire. Meaning, if Ole Miss were 8-3, this is probably already done. Be it Florida or LSU, whatever it may be. But ultimately, what's transpired here is the 2 weekends ago when a lot of this would have been the weekend before Layla Kiffin made that Monday visit to Baton Rouge. There were that weekend. There were some Florida media that were saying done deal. They were hyping Kiffin to Florida as a done deal. So what I knew was the Thursday before Layla Kiffin made her trip to Baton Rouge, that was happening. So over that weekend, when some of the Florida media was reporting done deal and all that sort of stuff, I was sitting there going, no, it ain't, because Layla Kiffin's going to be in Baton Rouge on Monday. As a matter of fact, this was my Locked On episode from that weekend. Lane Kiffin to Florida is far from a done deal. And Lane Kiffin to LSU is very, very, very much in play. So, again, that was the weekend before Layla Kiffin made her visit, when a lot of Florida media were saying that it was a done deal. And so that's why I continue to say I think they've been behind, because it's what I have had what I've heard through many different sources throughout this process is that Lane Kiffin, earlier in the process, before Layla Kiffin visited Baton Rouge, gave some assurances to Florida that he was going to be their coach. Now, again, nothing is binding until you have a signed document, but there have even been some who suggested that Lane Kiffin signed a memorandum of understanding, an MOU, with Florida. That's basically a term sheet. It's not binding, But that, as I understand, happened before Layla Kiffin made that visit to Baton Rouge. At least that's when I first started hearing about that. And why I've said that I think the Florida media was about a week to 10 days behind is because only last weekend did I start to have people on that beat express to me that they had heard that. I think they just started to find out about how maybe deep the Kiffin interest was from a week and a half prior, a week later. So that's why I think what they didn't, maybe a lot of people didn't quite understand was what happened a week ago. So follow this timeline, okay? So I find out on a Thursday, Layla Kiffin's going to be in Baton Rouge on Monday. So Layla makes that visit on Monday. At this point, Florida thinks that they've got Lane Kiffin, and they probably do, quite honestly. But Layla Kiffin makes the visit to Baton Rouge. Throughout the course of that week, so this was the week before Thanksgiving, throughout the course of that entire week, everything started building more toward LSU. Lane Kiffin was asking confidants in the profession, Nick Saban, Jimmy Sexton, Kirby Smart, and they were all telling him, as I understand it, they were all telling him that they think LSU is a better job than Florida. So everything starts to pivot. LSU, from the beginning, told Lane Kiffin they'd be willing to wait through the end of the college football playoff. Now, knowing full well that Ole Miss isn't going to let Lane Kiffin coach through the playoff. But as that week continues to go along, everything starts shifting toward LSU having the lead in the Lane Kiffin sweepstakes. And then, if you recall, that Friday, when the LSU board held their meeting, that's when they, behind closed doors in executive session, discussed the Brian Kelly buyout. But it's no coincidence that later that night, the terms of the offer to Lane Kiffin were leaked to Ross Dellinger, who reported them. So what that tells you is, in that meeting, they also okayed that. Lane Kiffin got the terms of the deal, or Jimmy Sexton through his representatives. And at that point, I believe, is when it became apparent that Lane Kiffin was going to pick LSU. And I believe that had been expressed through representation that LSU was going to be the destination. And that's why I think everyone has been radio silent here over the past week, because it was just about sweating out this week and the possibility of Lane Kiffin maybe having a change of heart and staying in Oxford. That's been the big maybe concern throughout the course of this past week. But Florida knew then that Lane Kiffin was leaning LSU. Florida knew a week ago. I had one high-level Florida booster express a week ago, the Thursday before Thanksgiving, that they were out of it, that they thought Lane was going to pick LSU. So they could still make calls. They could still try to keep their line in the water. But realistically, this thing all shifted to LSU in a certainly not a formal binding way, but in an overwhelming way a week ago. So now you get to this point where Florida has, and by the way, had tipped to Ross Dellinger. He didn't put out a big flashy report on Black Friday morning, but earlier this week, Dellinger put out that Florida had moved on in its search and was interviewing other candidates, something that I said here and on my radio show as well, that Florida had pivoted, that John Sumrall was going to be their target. And now we're hearing that John Sumrall is their target after Eli Drinkwitz has now signed his extension with Missouri. So I know everyone, by nature of the fact that you're watching this show, I'm assuming you're an LSU fan, most likely. And so you're curious about what this means for Lane Kiffin and LSU. I do have some thoughts on that, and actually what the plan B would be if Kiffin stays at Ole Miss, as our previous episode kind of discussed. So let me knock out these elements, and I'll come back and I'll continue filling you in on that here. It's Locked on LSU, your team every day. The holidays always feel a little easier when you already know the perfect gift. And Omaha Steaks makes it almost too simple. Whether you're treating yourself this season or sending something memorable to family and friends, Omaha Steaks delivers handcrafted perfection right to their door. And this week is the best time to jump in because their cyber sale is here and the deals are huge. The details are also. The quality is exactly what you hope for. It's incredibly tender steaks, rich flavor, and meals that make hosting or weeknight cooking easier. Save big on unforgettable gifts with Omaha Steaks. Visit omahasteaks.com for 50% off site-wide and an extra 20% off select favorites during their cyber sale. And for an additional $35 off, use promo code COLLEGE at checkout. That's omahasteaks.com, promo code COLLEGE Terms apply. See site for details. And we're brought to you by FanDuel. The NBA is back, and there's no better place to get it on the action than FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Even if you missed the start of the game or you want to ride the hot hand, FanDuel has live bets on everything from who will score next to fourth quarter comebacks. Plus, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay for a shot at a bigger payout. It keeps every game exciting, especially when your team's making that late push. Right now, FanDuel is giving new customers $300 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. So head to FanDuel.com to sign up and play your game with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. So as the Egg Bowl continues to play out, LSU is waiting on a decision from Lane Kiffin. I'll remind you that a week ago on Friday, after that meeting with Keith Carter, Lane Kiffin, and Chancellor Boyce, Keith Carter put out that statement where at the very end of the statement, he says, an announcement on Coach Kiffin's future is expected the Saturday following the game. So that would be a day from now that we're expecting Lane Kiffin would make an announcement. Now, this gets complicated based on what happens here on Black Friday. So Ole Miss is currently beating Mississippi State 21-10 right before halftime. So Ole Miss looks like they're in really good shape here to win this game. Now, if they win this game, they're going to be in the college football playoff. The further complicating factor would be if Ole Miss ends up in the SEC championship game. And there is a path for that to happen. So on Black Friday night, Texas and Texas A&M are going to play. If Texas upsets Texas A&M, that means Saturday night, the result of the Iron Bowl will determine if Ole Miss plays in the SEC championship. So again, if Ole Miss holds on and beats Mississippi State, Texas A&M and Alabama lose, then Ole Miss is in the SEC championship. And very likely Lane Kiffin would want to extend another week and coach in the SEC championship. Or maybe this might be the thing if he's starting to waver, to waffle, might be the thing that ultimately keeps him in Oxford and signs his extension with Ole Miss. So if you're watching the Egg Bowl broadcast, they did mention on the broadcast that Keith Carter, the athletic director, said he expects Lane Kiffin to stay at Ole Miss. What do you expect him to say? But he could have done that at any point over the last 6 weeks, signing the extension that's been on the table. He hasn't. Guys, shared with you on our previous episode, if you're an everydayer, you heard it, that maybe my best Ole Miss source told me on Thanksgiving morning that Lane was sort of waffling a little bit, that 4 days ago it was 90-10 he was going to end up at LSU, and now on Thanksgiving morning it was more like 55-45. So again, that's just one person's opinion and one person's read, but someone who is very connected in the inner workings of what's going on there with Lane Kiffin and Ole Miss. Now, the other complicating factor here is what happens with John Sumrall. So remember, Eli Drinkwitz has signed his extension at Missouri. And Clark Lee has signed an extension at Vanderbilt. So you're starting to see the coaching pool thin out here as it moves along. And so as I was told, Drinkwitz was LSU's number 2. Well, he's off the board. John Sumrall was next, so maybe he bumps up a spot. Sumrall, we've heard Kenny Dillingham. I've shared with you Blake Baker could be maybe the safety net hire for LSU if it gets to that. But Sumrall becomes an interesting target because there is some scuttle out there that Auburn wants John Sumrall, and they have maybe tried to press him for a decision because they don't want to end up in a situation where they're now bidding against Ole Miss or LSU or Florida. Well, very clearly what Florida is doing now is pivoting to John Sumrall. You might remember a week ago, Zach Abelverde reported that Sumrall was going to meet with Florida, and then ultimately that meeting was canceled, and there was this dispute as to whether or not it was ever scheduled. And all of this matters because as these dominoes fall and this game of musical chair starts to happen, like someone is going to land John Sumrall, and it really depends what starts with Lane Kiffin. So let's say hypothetically, Kiffin stays at Ole Miss. Just play the hypothetical. Let's say hypothetically Kiffin stays at Ole Miss. Well, LSU, Florida, and Auburn all want John Sumrall. What does John Sumrall want? I don't know. You could make a case for many of these. His wife is from Auburn. Their ties in Alabama. He coached at Troy. I mean, that could make a lot of sense. Well, he lives in New Orleans right now and is coaching Tulane and could very well end up wanting to stay in Louisiana knowing the value and the benefit of the LSU job, favoring it over the others. That's a possibility as well. Or maybe Florida has a first mover's advantage here if they're already in the Sumrall sweepstakes. They push him for a decision and they get John Sumrall. Again, I don't know how that's all going to play, but you could see these hypotheticals. And so the best case scenario for LSU, of course, is the Egg Bowl ends. On Saturday, Lane Kiffin announces he's leaving Ole Miss and he's the LSU coach. And on Monday, he's introduced. That's the best case scenario. And I'll tell you, that's what LSU has been expecting now for a week, since last Friday, that Lane Kiffin is going to be the LSU coach and that he'll be introduced, or he'll be in Baton Rouge, I should say, on Monday. That's been the expectation. But as I've said, every single time I've done one of these from the very beginning, it's never over until it is. You can have verbals, you can have handshakes, you can have MOUs. Until a binding agreement is signed and a coach is standing at the podium, it's never done. I think that's why this week was very uneasy around LSU, because even though they felt like they had Lane Kiffin or have Lane Kiffin, until you get him here on a signed contract, it's not done. And so some of that maybe you're feeling might be starting to transpire. So if Lane Kiffin, though, decides to stay at Ole Miss, is there enough time for LSU to pivot to John Sumrall? Maybe. But you would have to have an answer definitively from Lane Kiffin on Saturday so that you can turn all of your attention to Sumrall if, in fact, that's where you want to go. If not, is it Kenny Dillingham? Do you promote Blake Baker? The Baker component of it is something that I've described as, elevating the popular assistant. Financially, it would make a lot of sense as a guy who was already making $2.5 million. You'd keep your staff in place. You'd probably keep a lot of the roster in place, the recruiting class, all that. And you could sell it because there's plenty of examples of assistants promoted to get their first head coaching job at power programs and having success there. Marcus Freeman at Notre Dame, Ryan Day at Ohio State, Sharon Moore, Dan Lanning, Kirby Smart, Lincoln Riley at Oklahoma. There's plenty of those examples. Brent Venables right now at Oklahoma. So I'm not saying that that's going to be an easy sell to LSU fans. If you've dangled the Lane Kiffin carrot now for weeks and weeks, and it feels like you've had the momentum, Florida's out of it. They've been out of it, but now they're really out of it. And then you have to pivot, and you end up landing on promoting Blake Baker. I don't think that that's going to be the thing that's going to get a lot of juice into the program. But we should have an answer, hopefully, Saturday, not my timeline, according to Keith Carter's timeline, who last Friday when he released the statement said Saturday after the Egg Bowl, we should have an answer. What we know is clearly it's not going to be Florida, which I've been telling you that for weeks. Well, maybe not weeks. I've been telling you that certainly for a week that it was not going to be Florida. I believe the way I phrased it last weekend was last Saturday, the way I phrased it was, if Florida manages to get back in this for Lane Kiffin, it would be the greatest comeback since Lazarus. So clearly, this is not new, Florida being out of it. They've been out of it, despite the insistence of many Florida fans on Twitter, and unfortunately some Florida media that just didn't have their finger on the pulse of the situation. But we have, and so we'll keep you up to date here on Locked on LSU. If anything transpires, we'll be right back here with the absolute latest information. If we do get any type of information after the Egg Bowl from Lane Kiffin, you better believe we'll have an episode for you here on Locked on LSU. Hey, do me a favor, please subscribe on your favorite podcast app, rate us, leave a review. If you're on YouTube, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you're notified whenever we post a new video, and let a friend know if they love the Tigers. We got you here every single day for Locked on LSU, your team every day.